Hey guys, so we're going to do something a little bit different for the first 20 minutes of class. You're going to learn from me about the effects of the Great Depression via video, and what I want you to do as you watch the video, please jot down some general insights, some key points that you gained while watching the video, and then we will talk about the effects as a class. So as we learned about on Wednesday, one of the big things that the Depression was created was widespread unemployment, a decrease of wages, as well as hours, and all three of those factors led to Americans having less money, less income, which in turn caused them to not be able to pay for the basic necessities of life. That includes housing, and as we will see later, includes food. Now let's tackle the housing problem first. A lot of people could not pay their mortgages anymore, therefore foreclosed on their homes, meaning the bank took possession of their home. As a result, people had to be innovative. Okay, so if I have a family or I need shelter, how am I going to protect myself against nature? So in many cities, what sprout up were what we call shanty towns. They later became known as Hoovervilles, where basically people found whatever they could in the city, whether that be scraps, whether that be boxes, whether that be cardboard, and made a makeshift house out of it. Imagine living in that rather than a house that has air conditioning, that has running water, and everything that a person needs to live comfortably in life. Next thing that became widespread throughout cities were bread lines, where people would wait for long periods of time for simple food handouts like donuts and coffee. Another thing that became widespread, visits to soup kitchens, people looking for reduced or free meals in search of anything, any kind of food, because again, that lack of income prevented them from providing themselves with the basic necessities of life. If we talk about how the Great Depression affected the family, many men, as we will see, became transients, also known as hobos, wandering the country in search of work. Some men actually simply just left their wives and left their families because the despair, the heartache, and frankly the shame was too much for them to take. For women, unfortunately during this time, many women were bound to the house. It was socially stigmatized against women for them to not be working. They were expected to stay at home and take care of the children. So unfortunately, if your husband lost a job, you really had to rely on the generosity of others around you, or make do with what you had. That meant canning food, that meant sewing up old clothing to make new clothing, or just to salvage what you had. Some women tried to enter into the workforce to help their families out, but unfortunately, again, we make the parallel with African Americans. If men don't have jobs, then women should definitely not have jobs at this time, especially given the fact that the stigma back then was that women should be at home with the kids and taking care of them. Unfortunately, children suffered the most during the Great Depression because their families could not provide them with adequate nutritional foods. Malnutrition increased during this time. Children were not getting the nutrients that they needed each day for healthy growth, and there was an uptick in diet-related diseases, such as rickets. Rickets is a deficiency, meaning a lack of vitamin D, which you get from many fruits. So as we can see, children suffering. Some teenagers, think around your age, 13 to being 13, between 13 and 15, simply just left their families as they didn't want to be any more of a burden to their families. They simply, or some of them went off and looked for jobs to help out and send back to the family at home. So a very, very difficult time for the American family. Also for the typical person, mental health wise, the suicide rate in the U.S. between 1928 and 1932 rose by 30%. People's lives were turned upside down. Men who were used to working and providing for their family were now lived a totally different life, felt inadequate, felt that they could not do what they once did, and many people's identity tied to jobs that they have done, that they did for 10, 20 years gone. And many children, their dreams are crushed as far as whether it's going to college or pursuing some kind of trade after because of a lack of parental income. Farmers suffer greatly after European demand for U.S. crops decreased after the war. They could no longer pay for their loans. Therefore, the bank took their house, they took their farm, they took their equipment, they took everything. So what ultimately happened is farmers became homeless without sources of income, and honestly, without really any other work to provide source of income for them. And by about 1932, 400,000 farms were repossessed, meaning the bank took possession of them, and farmers were left to find other sources of income. To make matters worse, the land that we know as the Great Plains, stretching from Texas all the way up to North Dakota, was hit by the Dust Bowl, as it was famously known, in the 1930s. So, what happened during World War I to meet European demand? These farmers started to produce a lot on the soil. Now, the Great Plains soil is very fertile. It has a topsoil up here, and then everything down here is not so good soil, not so good for agriculture. But that topsoil, as long as you take care of that, you're going to have some really, really good crops. Now, what happened is that during World War I, to meet the demand, these farmers exhausted the topsoil. So drastically over time shrank it until it was no more, leaving the bottom soil, which was this grainy, gravelly, sandy type of soil. What happened in the 30s? Drought struck the region, again, from Texas to North Dakota, and unfortunately, what made the drought even worse was that the winds picked up. So the winds took this sandy, gravel soil and just swept it across the Great Plains throughout states, ruining many farms and ruining many infrastructure, meaning buildings. The dust actually carried as far as the East Coast into Pennsylvania, into big cities like New York. Ultimately, what the Dust Bowl did is it displaced a lot more farmers, and again, left a lot more farmers without sources of income, and they too became transient individuals, hobos, looking for work. Most farmers went to the west, to California, to work as pickers, but for very, very pickers on cotton farms or grapes or whatever, but they worked for a very, very small income. Okay, so make sure again you write down your major insights, and we will talk about it when you are done.